Hello in yet another video about Java. So this time what we are going to be covering is Mockito, or rather mocks, and how to actually use them to write out some integration tests. Because right now, if we were to write any sort of a test to our code, we are dependent on an outside service. In this case, the REST API that we are accessing via this URL. This is not something that is ideal, because if something breaks on the API side or something breaks with the internet or anything ever, then it means that our test will stop passing for reasons that are unrelated to our code. So this is something that we want to avoid. And in order to combat that, we can use mocks. And what actually are they? Before we start to use them, let's go and create some, rather not create, but add new dependencies into our build.gradle file with using the test implementation or Mockito JUnit Jupyter 5.12.0. Let's build the model of the Gradle, Ctrl-Shift-O. External libraries, we can see that we should be having some Mockito, and we do, Mockito Core and Mockito JUnit Jupyter. Let's create a new Java class for testing our API handler. So first things first, what do we need to do in order to start using mocks? We need to, on our class, use this specific annotation on the top of it, extend with Mockito extension.class. So with that, we can already start creating some mocks. And what exactly is a mock? I think that it will be the easiest to just show you with a presentation. If I create a mock of a list of strings, take note that I haven't initiated this, so this is essentially a null. And if I write out a test, public void Mockito showcase, and then within this test, what I want to show you is that I can simulate what this list will actually return. For example, when this list will be asked to get the 10th index, I want it to return the test. And when this list is asked about size, I want it to return 1000. So let's check using assertions whether this is true. Assert equals expected actual list that get 10, and assertions assert equals 1000 list that size. I mean, in all certainty, if we didn't have this mock, you would say that this is failing. But if I run this test, you can see that everything is passing smoothly, but there are no items in this list. I haven't initiated it, and the size is nowhere close to 1000. So why is it happening? Because that's the way that Mockito works. It allows me to create some objects that I can then use to simulate their behavior. It is very, very useful if we are talking about any sort of testing, because we have some databases, we have some services that are outside of our power to use, or rather simulate. So it makes total sense to actually use mocks because they are cheaper, faster, and we are not relying on some outside data to actually go through with our tests. So they are very, very useful in our day-to-day life. So now that we have this out of the way, let's talk about how we can use it in our API handler. The way to communicate with things and the way that we get some responses from the REST API is, of course, via the client. So the way that we would need to do this is we will need to simulate what the client is actually giving us in terms of the responses that we get to specific requests. And in order to achieve that, we would need to simulate, or rather use a mock as a client. However, in this particular approach, we are using private final field that we can't really substitute for anything. In order to combat this, we will need to introduce a constructor. And this constructor will be taking in a single parameter of the HTTP client. This.client equals client. So let's delete this. And in order for everything to pass, let's also delete the main code. And here you can see that in our API handler, we'll finally be able to actually substitute the value of a client. And how to actually do it? Let's rename this test to get single post test. And right now, what we'll be needing is a mock of private HTTP client, of course. We'll be needing a mock of or a mock? No, just a client will be fine. But no, response of response. So HTTP response of string. And we'll be using request separately. Okay, yeah. So yeah, now let's see what we can do. So whenever I want, so for example, let's say that I want to do with a happy path, right? So just asking a regular ask to my API, everything is working properly, I get a proper JSON, and everything is returned the way I would like for it to be returned. So in order to achieve that is, first of all, I want to create a JSON. It doesn't matter what's put here, it's just I'm testing here that if we get 200 from the API, then we're sending out proper response. So right now, I want to check out if when my client that sent, and here we need an HTTP request and body handler. So let's copy and paste the one from our API handler so that we are as close as possible to the thing that we have in our production code. Request body handler of string, importing static method, then return response. And let's mock out our response, and the response is going to be when response that body then return test JSON, and when response that status code then return 200. And here we need to add another exception. And what I want to do right now is assertions that assert equals $200. And we are lacking one critical thing, that is private API handler. And here we're going to be using our newly created constructor, handler equals new API handler, and we are injecting the client. So I want to client that, not client, but handler that get object by ID 1 that status code. I wanted to return 200, and I also wanted to assertions that assert equals JSON handler that get object by ID for 1. And one thing that I have done a mistake on, that is the HTTP request. I have copied over a wrong one. So what I want is this one. And copy and paste it, and instead of ID, I can just put in 1. So let's try and run this test. I need also body over here. That's why it was failing. So as you can see, the test is actually going through, but we know that in reality, if we were to use normal objects, then it would return false. And why is that? We are not really calling the API itself right now. What we are doing is that we are telling our client what to respond in particular cases and in particular situations. So this is actually the ideal scenario for us if we are going to test things that are outside of our jurisdiction, because we can actually put in here data that we would want to put in realistically and that we would get normally from the API. But right now, thankfully, we don't need to do it. So that is very, very powerful to be using. And here what is actually happening is that Mockito is checking if the client is using the request that we have input over here with this particular argument of HTTP response, then we are going to return response that we have mocked here, but only and only when we are using the request and the same HTTP response body handler. So if we were to put in another request here, it would break, it wouldn't work. So that's why it's very important to get as close as possible to what we would put in API handler. So in essentiality, we are just mocking this particular line of code and we are telling the Mockito what to return in particular cases. Of course, this opens up a whole world of possibilities, all the edge cases, all the unusual cases that would be very hard to really call. For example, if we were to get 404 or we were to get 500 or any other code that is annoying to really try to simulate, you can now use it with the Mockito and you can actually test out everything from integration standpoint easily. So thank you very much and see you in the next video.